Kittinger. He flew them as a test and fighter pilot. He is particularly fond of those machines he was one of the first to fly.
But it's always a thrill to fly on an airplane that's new off the production line. I volunteered constantly. My whole career, my whole life. When I was a Boy Scout, I'd volunteer. When I got in the Air Force, I volunteered. To me, it's a new adventure. It's something new. It's something everybody else doesn't want to do. So I always volunteer. I still do it. I still volunteer for things that nobody else wants to do because it's a challenge.
Like most of the visitors to the museum, Joe cannot fail to notice the rockets. But hardly anyone notices the small capsule on display behind the rockets. For Joe, it is one of a kind. This capsule changed his life and made history. It all began in 1953 in the desert of New Mexico. The U.S. Air Force was testing new warplanes on its remote Holloman Air Force Base. When Joe Kittinger was stationed here, he was 25 years old.
To me, it was very busy because there was an awful lot going on here. A lot of exciting things. I came here to be a fighter pilot, to be a test pilot, and so I immediately checked out every airplane I could find so that I could have that thrill of flying different types of airplanes.
Test pilots are a special kind of people, and Joe was no exception. He loved the speed and the danger. Test pilots are there to push the envelope. They have to take a new plane to its limits, but they mustn't go too far. For a few days every month, Joe's duties were of a quite different kind. He was assigned to the balloon unit. At the time, he never suspected it would change his life forever. The test pilot was supposed to accompany balloons with a slow airplane, not exactly a dream job. The meteorologist and flight director of the balloon unit, Duke Gildenberg, was well aware of this himself.
Fighter pilots are fighter pilots. All they want to do is be let loose and really do some fancy stuff with their jets. And most of the fighter pilots were bored by balloons. But you know, you're tooling along at 120 miles an hour, and they would sit there like this, smoking a cigarette with one hand on the wheel.
In the early 1950s, the U.S. Air Force used unmanned plastic balloons for military espionage. Satellites hadn't been invented yet. But many of the helium balloons serve very special research purposes.
But then as I found out the type of scientific flights they were making, I got more interested in it because they were going up into space.
Space. At the Holloman Air Force Base, this magical word was inextricably linked to one name, Dr. John Paul Stopp. He was the director of the Aeromedical Laboratory. Years before NASA was founded, Dr. Stopp had recognized that humans could conquer space. He wanted his experiments to provide the foundation for this endeavor. At the beginning of the 50s, there weren't any manned rockets yet. But despite this, Dr. Stopp wanted to research the human reaction to zero gravity and acceleration.
Dr. Stopp was a visionary. And he knew we were going to go into space. And he knew there was data that needed to be accumulated. There was no other way we could get that data except by a balloon.
Only balloons were able at the time to advance to the frontier of space and send data back to Earth from the stratosphere 40 kilometers above the Earth's surface. The researchers were particularly interested in cosmic radiation. The medical scientist David Simons was the one responsible for this issue in Stopp's team. It was his job to find out whether cosmic radiation was harmful to humans.
There'd never been a space flight. Man had never been in space. Air Force administration didn't think it was of any consideration or any concern. But those of us who were involved in it were concerned.
For their experiments, the researchers initially used animals as balloon passengers. First mice and hamsters, then monkeys. In small space capsules that were supplied with oxygen and fitted with measuring instruments, the animals floated at the edge of space for hours before they returned to Earth alive. After countless flights, David Simons believed he could assess the dangers.
Colonel Stapp walked into my office one day, asked me, Dave, have we done enough animal flights? Do you think it'd be safe for a man to be exposed to this kind of a cosmic radiation? And I said, oh, no doubt about that. It's not a serious hazard. He said, well, would you like to be the person to do it? And I said, oh, I'd love it. He said, okay, well, you're on.
One of the scientists mentioned that there was a new program coming along. My ears perked up, and I said, well, tell me about it. And they described it to me, and I immediately went to Dr. Stapp, and I volunteered to be a part of it.
Joe Kittinger was accepted into the project as a balloon pilot, but David Simons also had hopes for the first flight. After all, he was the scientist. Joe was only a test pilot. Together with the engineers and Dr. Stapp's team, the two men worked on constructing the capsule. The plan was for it to hang underneath the balloon and protect the pilot from the hostility of space.
Well, the whole gondola was experimental. So there was an awful lot of development work went into that capsule because it was the first spacecraft. It had never, a man had never gone up in a spacecraft before, and this was the first spacecraft.
Dr. Stapp gave the space project a memorable name, Man High. But there was more to this project than just building a space capsule. Joe and David had to be trained for their task as spacemen.
It was a 24-hour claustrophobia test in a very confined atmosphere, dark, with a panic button there, and if you couldn't take it, you hit the panic button and that terminated it.
It was very tight, very restricting, very hot, and very uncomfortable, and very necessary.
I'm a fighter pilot. I have discipline, and I can adapt to any environment, and I had no problem at all. It was just boring. Matter of fact, I went to sleep.
Their training also had its pleasant sides. Both David and Joe had to learn how to handle a balloon. For Joe, this became a passion that still captivates him today.
I'd say that probably the most enjoyable part of the man-high training was to learn how to fly a balloon. I was flying supersonic F-100s and F-104s, and all of a sudden now I'm flying a subsonic balloon. So that, to me, that was the most enjoyable part of the man-high.
Today, Joe usually uses hot air balloons, but in 1956 he prepared for his space flight in gas-filled balloons. The basic principle is similar. Hot air and helium gas are both lighter than the surrounding air, and thus cause the balloon and the pilot to rise. The balloon quickly became a very special kind of aircraft for Joe.
You go out to an airplane by yourself and take off and fly. But when you're going ballooning, it takes a crew to help you get the balloon inflated and chase it. So it takes a group effort to do a balloon flight. So there's a big difference there. There's a lot more indecision in ballooning than there is in aviation. In aviation, if you're flying, you can move the aircraft wherever you want to go. In a balloon, you go wherever God takes you.
Training the spacemen and constructing the space capsule took more time and money than originally planned. Dr. Stapp had to plead with his superiors to continue financing this project.
Space was a dirty word. The hierarchy didn't like the word. And of course, this really made it difficult to get funding for it. So the Man-High program had very bad funding from the very beginning. One of the things that was neglected because of money was we never put the capsule in an altitude chamber. So we bypassed that testing item. It flew without the gondola being tested in a chamber. It should have been made, and had it been made, we would have discovered the valve that was in backwards.
Despite the shortcut, Dr. Stapp considered the system ready enough for a test flight. The target altitude was 30 kilometers, 100,000 feet. He gave precedence to Joe Kittinger. The experiment required a pilot who would also be able to handle unforeseeable situations. On June the 2nd, at 6:30 in the morning, Man High 1 was ready for launch. A helicopter served as an open-air flight control center.
A couple of minutes after takeoff, I found out that my radio transmitter was not working. And so I had to use a Morse code to transmit to the ground. They could talk to me, I could hear their messages, but in order to talk to them, I had to use Morse code.
It just happened, being an old radio amateur, I could read it pretty well for myself. Some of the other people had some trouble with it because that wasn't their thing, but it's okay. I knew what was going on.
Shortly after that, I discovered that the oxygen system was really being depleted, and I couldn't figure out why. So I turned off all of the pressure and just kept putting oxygen into the gondola through my pressure suit to maintain the internal pressure. I didn't even tell the ground people about it because I didn't need them to enter into the decision making.
At an altitude of around 30 kilometers, the balloon reached its maximum expansion. After a good 2 hours, Joe was finally at his destination. He was floating at the edge of space. But his oxygen reserves were running out. Flight Director Duke Gildenberg became aware of this problem.
We had him read his gauges, and we could see that the oxygen was dropping off rapidly. And we said, Joe, we just can't do anything more because of the oxygen problem. Once you open your valve and start on down.
Well, if he wasn't, he was committing suicide, so far as we were concerned. If it's that dangerous, you don't play with it. Nobody questioned that.
But I had a very limited supply of ballast, so I had to be very discreet on how I let the gas out. So it's taken me longer to come down than I had really anticipated, but I would not rush it. So finally, Simons gets frustrated, and Simons sends me a message and says, "Come down."
Yes, right now.
Well, I'd been working diligently for an hour to come down, so I thought I would have some fun with Simons. So he had just said, "Come down," in a kind of belligerent manner, like an order. So I tapped out on the Morse code.
Come and get me.
I had a big joke. I was sitting there laughing my head off, thinking about the panicking down there.
Come and get me. So we got Colonel, he was really kidding, that's Joe all over. But we got Colonel Stapp to the mic, and Colonel Stapp said, "Captain Kittinger, this is Colonel Stapp. Will you please listen to Duke and open up your valve and start on down?" I said, "Yes, sir."
Carefully, Joe let off more helium. Finally, the balloon started to drop. He was on his way back down to Earth. During the last phase, Flight Director Gildenberg orchestrated the landing.
As I was circling him, Joe said, "Hey, Duke, are you going to put me down in the water? Put me on land, please." So I wound up putting him down in about 3 feet of water. And it was a real funny incident because a grandfather and his son were fishing there, and they see this capsule come out of the sky, and then it starts to unscrew, and the guy in the pressure helmet pops up, and the grandfather and his son took off. They thought it was an alien, maybe.
Despite all the problems, the flight was a triumph. the first spaceman in human history managed to get back to Earth safe and sound. Joe was the hero of the hour. With a cool head and strong nerves, he mastered the problem of the valve that was incorrectly fitted. How dangerous is it to breathe too little oxygen during a flight is demonstrated by the training of modern Air Force pilots at the Holloman Air Force Base. The pilots have to go into a pressure chamber to experience for themselves what it means to get insufficient oxygen at great altitudes.
All right, sir, I'm going to check you for a seal. Go ahead and hold your breath. 1, 2, 3. All right. Good. Hold your breath. 1, 2, 3.
The training exercise is meant to teach them how to recognize this dangerous situation, should it occur when they are flying.
Before we do take off, we do need to do an intercom check just to make sure that I can hear you and you can hear me.
Long seat 3.
We got a seat 4.
Fleming, seat 12.
Iowa 1, 2, 3.
The air is slowly being pumped out of the chamber. At the moment, the pilots are still being supplied with oxygen through their masks. Then the test begins.
On your hypoxia sheet.
The pilots have to write down how their body reacts while the oxygen level in their blood is falling. Physicians call this condition hypoxia. Some get numb fingers and nausea. Others feel euphoric when their brain gets less and less oxygen. Will they be able to recognize on time whether they are losing control? All that can help them then is fresh oxygen from their masks.
Student number 3, can you tell us your hypoxia symptoms?
Felt a little bit of numbness in my fingers. A little bit of tingling, mental confusion.
Sir, you need to correct. Put all 3 switches up. Student 3, you need to correct. All 3 switches. All 3 switches. All right, sir.
The pilot lost control. In an aircraft, this mistake would be fatal.
For student number 3 because he's not able to correct for himself. He does not understand what she is telling him at the moment.
Are you feeling all right, sir?
Feel much better now.
And you feel back to normal, sir?
Feel back to normal.
If you're on a test flight on an airplane and you have a problem, you can quickly get down to the ground. You can quickly descend and land. In a balloon, you can't do that. In a balloon, you have to stay there for a considerable period of time to get down. So the duration of danger in the event of a problem is higher with a balloon flight because it takes so long to come down.
An experiment from the 50s makes it very clear in what danger the balloon spacemen were at the time. At an altitude of 30 kilometers, there was almost no air outside of their space capsule anymore. They were almost floating in a vacuum. Even the smallest hole in the helmet seal could have had catastrophic consequences. The pressure falls catastrophically. And just a few seconds later, the pilot would lose consciousness.
If the suit fails, you're going to be dead real quick, and you know that. You accept that risk. It just means that you have to have more confidence in the equipment. But if it fails, I mean, you're faced the reality that if you do have a failure, you're going to die real quickly.
2 months after the first mission, the balloonists were ready to ascend up to those hostile altitudes for a second time. This time it was the scientists' turn. David Simons was slated to spend at least 24 hours at the edge of space to observe his surroundings and collect data. The launch took place from the bottom of a disused iron ore mine. Open terrain was too risky because of the strong winds. Early in the morning of August the 19th, 1957, David Simons was floating towards space. At an altitude of 30 kilometers, he had the most spectacular view.
The sky wasn't just very, very dark blue, but it looked like absolutely black. So I saw this thin band of sky around me and nothing above. My golly, if I use my imagination, I think I can finish that ball and see how big it was. And I said, I don't know, I have a pretty good imagination, and I'm not sure I can make it. That's a big one.
Over the next few hours, the balloon hung almost motionless at the edge of the atmosphere. Towards the evening, something unexpected happened. A weather front moved into the flight area. Thunderclouds were piling up. Initially, David stayed calm in the space capsule.
Well, I was at that point nearly 100,000 feet, at least 90,000 for sure. And we didn't think they went above 65,000. So first of all, I was enjoying the show.
But the entire team had underestimated the situation. The clouds also cut David off from the Earth's heat radiation. This caused the helium in the balloon to cool, and as a result, the balloon shrank, lost its lift, and started to sink. Suddenly, David found himself in the midst of the thunderclouds. He decided to get rid of all the extra weight, but that only prevented him from sinking any lower. For the rest of the long night, David hovered just above the threatening lightning.
Then I had a most wonderful sight that I'd seen for a long time. Sunrise. Once that hit up for a few minutes, we got it made.
An Air Force doctor and scientist, Major David Simons, prepares for a balloon ascent to the very rim of the stratosphere, 100,000 feet up. 32 hours later, the balloon returns to Earth, and Major Simons emerges from the cramped gondola safe and sound. He set new records for height and endurance, but more important, he provides living proof of man's ability to carry his own atmosphere into the near vacuum of outer space.
We thought after the mission was over, boy, we're going to get millions of dollars to go on with this. And we were talking about building one with a platform outside where you could walk out on the platform and do a lot of things, you know.
We always hoped that we'd get the funding and the support that we needed, but it wasn't to be.
Only 6 weeks after David Simons' flight on the 4th of October 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first satellite into orbit, Sputnik 1. The Cold War had arrived in space.
I remember the beeping, and I remember thinking that this was the beginning of the space program. There wasn't any doubt in my mind when I heard that Sputnik that we were in a race. And that was going to be the stimuli to get us, the U.S., going.
I remember the headlines in the El Paso Times when this happened, saying, hey, we have to get in with this. Let's take Colonel Simons and his balloon gondola and put it on a rocket with him in it and get started. So that's what how our involvement was highlighted. But NASA was ginning up at the same time, and they just took over. So the space program got kind of out of our hands.
The newly formed National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, launched $1 million program to catch up to the Soviets' head start. But at first, the Americans suffered major setbacks. While NASA was still trying to launch their unmanned rockets without accidents, Dr. Stapp's team was already one step ahead. They were asking themselves how future astronauts could be rescued in case of an emergency.
The opportunity for escape is very small. It's only sitting on the pad. It's only on the launch sequence up to a certain altitude, and then there's no escape.
Dr. Stapp and Joe Kittinger wanted to find out whether an astronaut would still be able to leave the rocket at 100,000 feet.
NASA had so many things they were concerned about, engineering challenges, that was the last thing that they could ever think about, was how to provide a means of escape from high altitude.
Stapp and Kittinger were familiar with the problem from the Air Force. During the mid-50s, the jets were flying higher and faster than ever before.
If a man ejects at high altitude, the first thing is the deceleration. You're doing Mach 3 or Mach 2, and you have to slow down, and you slow down immediately. And if you decelerate too rapidly, it'll kill you.
This deadly danger still threatens fighter pilots today. In the Research Center of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, engineers are still searching for an optimal way to perform an emergency exit, causing the least amount of injury possible. The equipment and ejector seat are real. The crucial difference is that in place of a real human who could injure muscles and bones is a dummy full of measuring instruments and sensors. The catapult will accelerate the seat in a split second from 0 to 50 kilometers an hour.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
During this experiment, the dummy has to endure 20 times its own weight. The experts call this 20 Gs. In the event of a real ejection scenario, the forces acting on the pilot's body could be much greater still. Where is the limit? What forces can a body withstand? Researchers are still referring to the data from the 50s for which Dr. Stapp risked his life. Using a rocket-propelled sledge, he upped the forces acting on his own body from one experiment to the next. Stapp's self-experiment surpassed everything that had been thought possible until then. In just a few seconds, he braked from more than 1,000 kilometers per hour to 0. His body had to withstand more than 45 Gs, a weight of more than 3.5 tons. Stapp survived with only minor injuries and thus proved that an astronaut would be able to exit a rocket even at high speeds.
Once you survive that, now you have to get down to a lower altitude, because the true airspeed that you're going at is phenomenal. And there's no density there. So when the parachute opens, it opens at an extremely high rate, and it will destroy the parachute. And not only that, it'll give you a very high G.
So the life-saving parachute can also severely injure a pilot. The faster he's going, the worse it is. The researchers from the Air Force are working on providing the best protection for the pilots as possible.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Pilots today have the following safety rule. The parachute opens only when they're below 20,000 feet.
The only way you can survive is to free fall down to below about 20,000 feet before you can deploy the parachute. That time, from the time you decelerate to down to the altitude, is a time that's you're very vulnerable to tumbling and spinning.
To solve this problem, Dr. Stapp and Joe Kittinger created Project Excelsior in 1958. At first, they tested the emergency exits at 100,000 feet on dummies. They quickly discovered that the problem was even bigger than they had thought. The dummies were spinning uncontrollably.
If you get spinning too rapidly, it'll kill you. Over 200 RPM would kill a man. Over about 120 RPM, you become unconscious.
For months, they worked on a technical solution. They finally developed a multi-stage parachute system. First, an automatically triggered drogue chute was deployed to stabilize the ejecting pilot at higher altitudes. The main parachute also opened automatically, but only later, at 20,000 feet. Halfway through 1959, the men working on Project Excelsior considered their system well enough developed to test it on a human being. Joe Kittinger, the project leader, knew he would be the one to jump.
Unfortunately, there was no airplane that would take us up to 100,000 feet. Had there been one, I would have used that. I could have gone up to altitude to 100,000 feet, ejected from the airplane. Been much simpler, much easier to do. But unfortunately it wasn't, so we had to use a balloon vehicle.
Joe settled for an open gondola. It was easier, but also had its dangers. On his way into the stratosphere, he had to bear temperatures of minus 70 degrees Celsius. That's why electrically heated socks and gloves were part of his equipment. His spacesuit was the only thing protecting him from the deadly vacuum. Every part of the equipment was tested time and again.
I did this 100 times altitude chamber with my pressure suit, going through the checklist, getting everything completed. I did it 1,000 times in my mind.
Early in the morning on the 16th of November 1959, the time had come. In the desert of New Mexico, Joe prepared for his jump. For 2 hours, he breathed pure oxygen to get the nitrogen that's present in regular air out of his system. It was a precautionary measure in case his pressure suit failed, because then the nitrogen would form dangerous gas bubbles in his blood.
Now, here it was finally taking off. I'd worked for 1.5 years for this day, and it was really an exciting event for me to be taking off on my way into space.
Shortly after sunrise, the air was calm as if it was holding its breath.
What you really worry about the most is what you haven't thought about, what you haven't anticipated. That's what you worry about. How many things don't I know that could happen?
This flight wasn't supposed to go all the way up. The planned altitude of Excelsior 1 was 65,000 feet.
So now I'm getting at altitude. I start the countdown, go through all the checklist, and it comes time in the checklist for me to stand up. And I can't stand up. I'm stuck in the seat, and I can't figure it out. And I'm really getting frantic because I've got to get out of that gondola. So I'm wrestling and I'm pulling, and I finally jerked myself out of the seat and stood up and jumped overboard.
What Joe didn't know was that in the hectic struggle before his jump, he triggered the automatic parachute too early.
And the little stabilization chute came out, and lacking sufficient velocity, wrapped around my neck. And all of a sudden I started turning violently to the right. I had an altimeter and a stopwatch on my left wrist, and I wanted to see what altitude I was at, but the centrifugal force was so great I could not pull my arms in. And then all of a sudden I lost consciousness.
But Joe was lucky. The main parachute was working and opened automatically. Although the rapid spinning caused him to lose consciousness, he landed without injuries.
When I woke up, I was disappointed because we'd had the problems. And I felt I'd let my team down, I'd let Dr. Stapp down because we came very close to getting killed.
To this day, Joe can remember well how guilty he felt. He was the project officer, and for a moment it seemed as if Project Excelsior was at an end.
Dr. Stapp and I had to go to our headquarters and make a presentation in front of the generals because I came very close to getting killed on the first jump, and they were very reticent to let me do it again. And once again, Stapp took it on himself to approve the program, so he was an extremely brave man, because if I would have gotten killed, he'd have been around forever bearing the burden of that flight.
Joe himself didn't hesitate for one moment to do it all again.
We knew what caused the problem on Excelsior 1, and we knew that we had not given the system a fair opportunity to show what it could do, and we were all anxious to get back out and do it again. Now we were cleared for the great jump. And that was our real goal from the very beginning, was to jump from 100,000 feet.
Again, the crew prepared the sensitive plastic balloon for its launch before sunrise. And again, the meteorologist Duke Gildenberg was there.
You know, for his final jump, when we knew it was going to be a hairy one from high altitude, he'd go around trying to calm the crew while we were preparing for the launch. And he was going up one of the most dangerous jobs in history. And the crew was all shook up, and he was trying to calm us down.
Then it was time for Joe to prepare. Putting on the suit, the parachute, and the instruments was awkward and took a long time. The entire equipment weighed 75 kilograms, as much as Joe himself. The balloon was launched exactly on time, at 5:30 in the morning. Its destination, the stratosphere, at 100,000 feet. 35,000 feet higher than the first jump that had almost cost Joe his life.
Now, psychologically, there was a big difference in my mind. I always felt that if the pressure suit had failed at 75,000 feet, that I had a chance to live. But at 100,000 feet, if you lose the pressurization, you're dead. So when I got to 40,000 feet, I suddenly discovered that my right hand was not pressurized. The pressure suit glove broke. I knew if I told them on the ground that it was not pressurized, they would have made me abort. So I made a conscious decision not to tell them.
Joe only had a vague idea of what would happen to his hand. He didn't know what had been tested 1 year earlier in this experiment. A volunteer in the pressure chamber. Little by little, an ascent to 100,000 feet was simulated. The falling pressure caused extreme swelling of the hands.
My hand kept swelling, and it was a constant pain. It wasn't excruciating because as my hand swelled, because of the lack of pressure, it swelled into the glove, and the glove helped pressurize my hand. But I couldn't use it. I could not use my fingers. I couldn't use my hands.
But Joe took the risk of performing all the maneuvers with his left hand. He wanted to jump, and he wanted success.
I looked out at the horizon. It was so beautiful up there. It's just gorgeous, the view. But right outside is death, because there's nothing there. It's like being surrounded by arsenic, that if you're exposed to that arsenic, you die. I went through the checklist. I stood up and I said, Lord, take care of me now. And it was the most fervent prayer I've ever said in my life.
Minutes of free fall until he reached the clouds. Joe was traveling at 988 kilometers per hour. To this day, he holds the record for the fastest ever free fall. Minutes after his jump at the edge of space, he was back on Earth. Even for hard-boiled Joe, the jump was a completely unique experience. The adrenaline masked the pain in his swollen hand, a moment of triumph.
And you got to remember, there was a lot of people that said we couldn't do it. There was a lot of people that didn't think we could accomplish this task. So we showed they were wrong. So we were happy about that.
Joe Kittinger was at the height of his career as a test pilot. Project Excelsior was celebrated in the media. Joe was the new hero of an entire nation. Together with his wife Pauline, he was invited to the White House in Washington to accept the Harmon Trophy, a distinction for the best pilot and the best balloonist of the year. President Eisenhower personally handed over the award. But again, the public attention was short-lived. Again, rockets stole the balloonist's fame. Just a few months after Joe's jump on the 12th of April 1961, Yuri Gagarin from the Soviet Union was getting ready for his trip into space. The Americans also brought their heroes into position. The 7 astronauts of the Mercury program were celebrated like pop stars, even before the launch. But Joe wasn't bothered.
I knew all of them, but they had the same ingredients that I had. First of all, they were fighter pilots. They were test pilots. So there was a lot of commonality between all of us. When the astronaut program started, I went to Dr. Stapp and talked to him at great length about it. And he told me, if you go, it'll take us a couple of years to make up what we have in you. So I did not volunteer for the program.
And so it was that it wasn't Joe who was the first American to circle the Earth in February 1962, but the Navy pilot John Glenn.
No, it didn't hurt. We all felt that we had contributed for it. The Man-High program helped NASA accomplish what they did. The Excelsior program helped. All of those were just small contributions to the space program.
Unfortunately, NASA ignored the important insights of the balloonists. They chose, for example, to fill their space capsules with 100% oxygen, despite all the warnings by Dr. Stapp and his team.
If you had a fire with 100% oxygen, it was brutal. So we made a decision, the Air Force made a decision, we would never have a 100% oxygen environment. And we recommended to them not to do it. But NASA opted to go ahead anyway.
Gus Grisham, Edward White, Roger Chaffee. They were the crew of Apollo 1. In 1967, a fire broke out in their capsule during a launch pad exercise. In less than 30 seconds, all three of them were dead.
I felt terrible about it because I lost two very close friends in that accident. I felt terrible about it because NASA had been so negligent in allowing a 100% oxygen environment in a spacecraft, and we had proven to them they should never go that way. So I was very bitter about it personally.
Joe was convinced that the space agency also frivolously dismissed important insights in another disaster. A NASA report later confirmed that the crew of the Challenger space shuttle was at first unharmed after the explosion.
When the Challenger blew up, those people would have had a chance for survival if they would have had the escape system that we had developed back in 1959, 1960. But that was NASA's decision.
Today, the American Space Agency is working on the successor of the space shuttle. In the wind tunnel, engineers are testing models of the new spacecraft. This time, safety is the #1 priority, just like it was in the 50s with Joe and the balloonists. The space capsule, called Orion, will get a rescue system. During the launch, and up to an altitude of 300,000 feet, it will bring the astronauts to safety in the event of an emergency. But the crew won't wear personal parachutes. If the main rocket were to explode, the rescue rocket at the tip should pull the entire capsule out of the danger zone and save all 6 astronauts at the same time. Unlike Joe, NASA doubts whether a parachute jumper would be able to arrive back on Earth unharmed. For Joe and his comrades in arms, it is not important which rescue system NASA will use. The main thing is, the safety of the astronauts is once again paramount. Joe, the first spaceman, is now 79 years old and still spends all of his free time on the airfield. He has flown almost 100 different types of aircraft and balloons in his life. He secretly dreams of returning to space one last time.
I would love to have a ride the space shuttle before they close it down. I would go in a heartbeat. And I bet you I could fly that thing just as good as the pilot on there. Give a little bit of training, I could fly anything.